Good to see you all today. You know, a few years ago, my wife Sandy and I went to Paris on our honeymoon. And we saw the sights there, right? Like we saw the Mona Lisa. It's actually not as big as you think it is. It's a pretty small, and we had like forced ourselves in there and hold on, we're going to get a picture. And we drove past the Arc de Triomphe. You think roundabouts are crazy? Like the French people come in, it's like a big roundabout around the outside of it. The French people come in at an angle like this. They don't merge. They zoom straight in, We walked through the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Beautiful. Like one of the things we learned is when that was constructed, very few people had actually seen their reflection before. And so you walk through the Hall of Mirrors and it's a big deal, right? But there's nothing that says Paris like what? The Eiffel Tower, right? You see it, and it just, it belongs there. I don't know about you, but if you ever go to a place that you've heard about, I'm kind of weird. I stand there and go, yeah, sure enough, there it is. It exists. There it is. Eiffel Tower during the day is beautiful. It's impressive. It's huge, but at night, it's something else. It's got the lights all over it, and at the top of every hour, they just set it off, and it starts sparkling like crazy. But here's something that most people don't understand about the Eiffel Tower is that it was not meant to be permanent. It was built in 1889 for the World's Fair, and the plan was that they were going to tear it down after about 20 years. But when those 20 years were up, the people of Paris looked at that tower and they said, no, we're going to keep that thing. That thing belongs there, right? That thing's going to stay there. And so what's happened with every generation since is every once in a while it'll come up, and every generation since confirms that, no, that belongs there. That thing exists and it belongs there, and that's what defines Paris right there, is that tower. And so that's the word we're going to hold on to this morning, is we're going to talk about the word confirmation. To confirm something. When you confirm something, you're not creating something new. What are you doing? You're saying that still stands, right? That's what you're doing when you confirm something. And that's what we're looking at in Genesis chapter 26. By this point in the story, we get here, and Sarah has died. Sarah died back in chapter 23. Abraham dies in chapter 25. And so we get to this chapter, and now Isaac's grown up, and Isaac is the head of the family. And here's what's interesting is that God doesn't give Isaac like a whole new set of promises. What does he do? He confirms the same promises that he already made to Abraham. And so the message of this section really is the covenant still stands. The message of this section here is God's plan hasn't changed. God still stands. God is still faithful. And everything that he has said. What God builds, he keeps confirming. And what God confirms never falls apart. I want you to think about all of this from Isaac's side of it, right? His father's gone, and everybody that he knows, everybody that loved Abraham, now that Abraham is dead, what question are they asking? Did the promise die with Abraham? Was that it? I mean, did it die with Abraham, or is it still going? And so God walks up to Isaac and repeats in this section, repeats the same promise, word for word. Same land, same blessing, but there's this new generation that's hearing it. And so that's Isaac's story. He's a man who inherited a promise. He wasn't there when the covenant was made, when it was created, but he inherited this thing. And so we get to chapter 26, and 26 starts with a trouble. It starts with trouble because there's a famine in the land. And as you read the section, some things are going to sound very familiar to you because Isaac faces the same kind of stuff that his father faced in Genesis 12 and following, right? Because we spent a lot of time talking about Abraham's faith, but Abraham, man, he wasn't perfect, right? Y'all who've read through that story, you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, he had moments of fear. He had moments where he did not trust God to protect him. He had moments where he tried to fix situations on his own. And sadly enough, we read about Isaac, and Isaac falls into the same stuff that his father did. And so when famine hits, Isaac starts heading toward Egypt. Now, why would he head toward Egypt? Because that's exactly where his dad went when a famine hit during his lifetime, right? So a famine hits, he goes toward Egypt. And God stops him. And here's what it says. Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while. I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. So we read, and Isaac obeys. He stays in this area called Gerar. But there's something that happens there that, once again, sounds very familiar. It says, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister, because he was afraid to say, she is my wife. If you remember anything about Abraham, why did they do this? Why did these two guys do this? Their wives are so beautiful, they're afraid that somebody's going to kill them, right? To take their wife, so they lie and they go, this is my sister. Abraham did the same thing. He actually did it twice. He did it once with Pharaoh in Egypt, and he did it once with these very same people, probably a previous Abimelech, but both times Abraham lies because he's afraid, right? He's afraid they're going to kill him. And Isaac didn't see all that happen, but he knew how dangerous it was. And he knew the promise God had just given him. But man, when the fear showed up, he makes his father's mistake all over again. And I want you to sit with that for a minute. If the promises depend on Isaac getting everything right? If the promises depend, if they depended on Abraham getting everything right, and now if they depend on Isaac getting everything right, where does it go from here? It's the end. But the promise never rested on Abraham's perfection or Isaac's perfection. The promises rested on God's perfection and righteousness. And so God comes through for him in this instance, because when Abimelech finds out what's going on and the truth and that she's really his wife, Abimelech doesn't punish Isaac. What does he do? He protects him. Here's what it says there. He says, anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So here we have Isaac. He lies, he fails, yet God is still keeping his word to him. And because of the faithfulness of God, he's protected. Right? Paul asks a question that echoes all the way back to Genesis 26 when he writes in Romans. He says, what if some were unfaithful? Will their faithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? And then he says, not at all. And what he means there is, God is going to accomplish the things he's out to accomplish, right? Are we able to thwart that by being no, God's still going to do what he's going to do. God is up to something. God made promises. God will fulfill those promises, right? And so Isaac's failure does not cancel the covenant that God made. Abraham's failures did not cancel the covenant that God made. And let me tell you this, your failures do not cancel the covenant that God has made and God's faithfulness. God does not scrap his plan when you mess up. God does not change his plan when you mess up. What does God do? He does correct us. He does grow us. He does call us forward. But his covenant and his promises are built on who he is. The same God who confirmed his promise to Isaac is the God who continues to confirm his promises to us. We get to this section, and a lot of people skip over because they don't think a lot's going on here with Isaac, so they kind of skip over a lot of the Isaac stuff. Especially this section, because you read it, and what does it appear to be? It appears to be a bunch of arguments over wells, a bunch of arguments over water wells. And people read it like, yeah, big deal. Let's move on. But a well isn't just a hole in the ground back then, right? What is it? A well meant your life. A well meant your family either survived or it did not survive. A well meant this is how you're going to water your animals, and this is your future, right? This is security, having a well. And we're going to find out here that God blesses Isaac so much. It says, the man became rich and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. And so we're going to see his flocks, they multiply. His herds grow. God blesses this guy so much, it is impossible to miss it. And the Philistines, the people he's living among, they notice. But instead, they didn't go, oh, great, let's be happy for the guy, right? What do? Man, they're jealous of him, and that jealousy turns into resentment, and that resentment turns into destruction. And they go after the very thing that represents his future. It says, so all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up filling them with earth. What did they do to his wells? And then Abimelech, the king that protected him before, says, move away from us. You've become too powerful for us. So Isaac packs up and he moves from like the big populated area, and he moves everything out into the valley, right out into the country a little bit. And so he's there, and he's not starting from scratch. It says he reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham. He gave them the same names his father had given them. And so here he is. He's not starting from scratch. He's actually standing on ground that had already been established by his dad. And they open up the wells, and his servants strike water. And what we find out is, as soon as he opens up a well and it starts producing water, the herdsmen from Gerar immediately come in and they take the well away from him. The first one's named Esek, and that word means dispute. But he moves on. And he opens up another one. He digs another one. And as soon as there's water, the herdsmen come in again and they take the well from him. And he names that Sitnah, which means hostility. So what's the pattern so far? 2 wells, right? 2 fights. 2 chances. What could he do? He could dig in, right? I mean, not pun intended, but he could dig in. He could refuse to move. He could fight. He moves on again, and this time moves out a little bit farther, and he digs a well, and he names it Rehoboth, which means open space. And verse 22 says, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." I want you to notice there that Isaac could have fought over Esek. He could have fought over Sitnah. He could have spent his entire life proving that he was right, defending ground that people tried to take from him. But what did he do? Instead, he walked away twice. Why? Because he trusted the God who already promised him what? Not just those wells. What did God promise him? God promised him all of that land, right? All of it was his. And people, there is freedom in knowing that your future does not depend upon you winning every argument. Sometimes faith looks like the fight. And sometimes faith looks like walking away and digging again somewhere else, right? The question isn't, are people going to throw dirt in my well? Because they will. Anybody ever experience that? Anybody ever throw dirt in your well? The question is whether you're going to trust God enough to keep digging. And so after Rehoboth, he travels to Beersheba. We've heard that place again because his dad had been there before, right? Abraham had been there in Beersheba. And he gets there, and what do you think? He's going to have a little bit of peace there? Well, God shows up again, right? God shows up again. He says this, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." The promise isn't just something that this guy inherits from the past. It's something that God shows up to confirm to him right now in his own life. And how does Isaac respond? Look at this. It says, Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and there pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. I want you to notice the order of things there. First thing, what did he do? He built an altar, then a tent, then a well. Before Isaac secured his future, what did he do? He worshiped the God who he believed was holding his future, right? And then we keep reading, in this Abimelech guy, he shows up again. The guy that told him to get out comes back, and he's got his advisor with him, and he's got his commander with him, and he says, man, clearly, we saw clearly that the Lord is with you. This guy's so prosperous that outsiders saw it. People who had opposed him and tried to destroy him saw him being prosperous once again, and they could not explain it other than saying, we know God is with you. It shows that God is with you. And so he asked for this peace agreement. They share a meal, they make a promise, and they part in peace. And it says, that same day, Isaac's servants come running to him, saying, we found water. And he names the well Sheba. And that's connected to the word oath. And that's why it's called Beersheba. So I want us to step back a little bit. I want us to see the picture of this whole thing, right? So Abram dug a well at Beersheba, called on the name of the Lord. Now Isaac eventually comes back to that same spot, comes there, builds an altar, digs a well again, same place, same promise, same faithful God. And so what we're seeing in these chapters, 2 generations, 1 covenant. The covenant is confirmed again. And so what Genesis 26 does is it answers a question that every generation eventually asks. Genesis 26 answers a question that every generation eventually asks, and that is, do God's promises still count for me? Do God's promises apply to me? Do they mean something to me? Or is it just for the generation that came before me? Are God's promises still real? Because Isaac wasn't there when God first called Abraham. Isaac wasn't there. He wasn't there in Genesis 15. He wasn't there when God sealed the covenant by passing through the pieces. He inherited the promises secondhand. And then eventually God shows up. And Isaac has his own encounter with God, his own famine, his own fear, his own mess-ups. But that's what confirmation is. It's not saying, here's something brand new. It's reminding us of what God said, and what God said still stands. In every generation, what God has said stands. See, this is why Paul, in 2 Corinthians 1:20, that's why Paul says, so for no matter how many promises God has made, they are all yes in Christ, right? Every promise God ever made. The promise to Abraham, the promise to Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, the prophets, they finally get yes in Jesus. Jesus is not a backup plan. He is the confirmation of everything God has been saying since the very beginning. The promise that through Abraham's family, every nation on earth is going to be blessed, gets sealed at the cross, and it walks out of that empty tomb alive. So if you've ever wondered whether the promises that you read about in God's word apply to you, whether the forgiveness, the presence, the purposes given to somebody 2,000 years ago actually mean anything, Genesis 26 says, yes. God is not some distant relative who spoke once and then went away. He shows up for the next generation. He confirms it to Isaac at Bathsheba. And through Jesus, he is confirming these things, the truth of his word to us right now. And so here's where it gets really personal, right? Because every one of us have wells, things that we're counting on, right, to keep us going. And sooner or later, somebody or something is going to throw dirt into the exact thing you are depending on. The question is not, is it going to happen? It will happen. But what will you do with that? And what Isaac did was he didn't waste his life fighting over disputed ground. He got up and he dug again. And he kept digging until he found Rehoboth. He kept digging until he found room to breathe. And so many of you are in an Essek season where every conversation feels like a fight. Maybe you're in your Sitna season. You're worn out from defending ground that actually really was never the point. And so here's what God says to us in those seasons. Don't be afraid. I am with you. Keep digging. Rehoboth is coming. Earlier, I brought up the Eiffel Tower. You know, it needed a city council to renew its lease. If they didn't renew the lease, what would happen? The whole thing would be sold for scrap. But God doesn't need reminding, and he doesn't need a committee vote. He showed up to Isaac not because the promise was about to expire, but because he wanted Isaac to hear it for himself in his own generation. And he wants the same thing for us. The promises that we find in the Word of God made to people thousands of years ago, thousands of years before you were even born, were never meant to stay locked up in the past. Through Jesus, every one of them is confirmed and signed and sealed, and they have been delivered to you. So dig your well. Trust his word. He is with you. He will bless you, not because of who you are, but because of who he is and who he always has been. And if you want to make a decision for the Lord today and you want to give your life to that God, I say come forward, a person who believes, change from serving yourself to serving him, be joined with Jesus in his death, burial, and resurrection, and rise up as a brand new creation.